Hey, seventh graders. Welcome back to week 5. I am Mr. Prest, and today we're going to be talking about historical perspective. And specifically, we're going to be talking about perspective in relation to the dropping of the atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So before you get started, make sure you have a pencil and a piece of paper. And I want you to ask yourself, how are you feeling mentally? Do you need a break? Have you just been doing a lot of English or math and you need to take a few minutes and get a glass of water? If you do so, please take that break now. And are you in a space to be productive? Do you need to move somewhere else? Do you need to get away from the TV? Do you need to lock your phone up? If you do, please do so now as well. So I told you guys a couple weeks ago that we're going to be doing a weekly riddle. And I said that if you email me the correct answer to that riddle, I'll give you a shout out. So I had 3 people email me, so that shout out's going to come in a second. But let's talk about last week's riddle first. So it was, what travels the world but stays in the corner? So if you thought about it, the answer that makes the most sense should have been a stamp. So you'd think about it, if you mail a letter to Dublin or Mumbai, you have to put a stamp in the corner. So it's traveling the world, but it stays in the corner. Shout outs to Temple Gingras, Sterling Franklin, and Max Boehm. I hope I said your last name right, Max, who emailed me the correct answer. So good job. Here's this week's riddle. What has to be broken before it can be used? What has to be broken before it can be used? So here's my email address down the bottom corner. Don't be afraid to shoot me an email if you think you know the answer with your first and last name so I can give you a shout out. Okay, so by the end of this lesson today, you will be able to describe the background of the atomic bomb and the reasons why the American military used it on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and analyze primary sources in order to understand the historical debate about the bomb. So the schedule is we've got 3 words of the week. Then we're going to talk about the background information on the atomic bomb and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because most of you guys probably didn't get to that before school ended, essentially. So you probably got to about halfway through World War II. And then we're going to look at some primary sources together. And I'm just going to briefly go over the weekly mission at the end of this. And that's the mission you'll be doing on Thursday. So the words of the week are atom bomb, kamikaze, and physicist. So what I want you to do on your pencil or on your piece of paper with your pencil, I want you to write the definitions for each of these as I go through them. And feel free to pause it if you need to, if you need more time to write them. So atom bomb, a bomb whose violent explosive power is due to the sudden release of energy resulting from the splitting of nuclei of a heavy chemical element, such as plutonium or uranium, by neutrons in a very rapid chain reaction. Now, if that doesn't make a ton of sense, there's a video later that I think does a really good job of explaining how an atom bomb works. I cannot explain it very well because I am a history teacher and a librarian. I'm not a physicist or a physics teacher or anything like that. So that's why I had the result to the video for that. The next word is kamikaze. I think this one's important to go over because this word often shows up in popular culture too, like video games and TV shows, and it has a historical meaning. It's a member of a Japanese air attack corps in World War II assigned to make a suicidal crash on a target, such as a ship. And you'll see why we're talking about that later. And finally, physicist, a scientist who studies matter, energy, and their interactions. So here's some of the background for the atomic bomb. Since the beginning of World War II, Americans had learned that the Germans were trying to develop a superweapon using the energy released by splitting radioactive atoms. A lot of Jewish scientists had fled Europe to kind of get away from the Nazi persecutions of the Jews. Those scientists, some of them came to America, and they helped the Americans develop this new bomb. Because what ended up happening was the American government was racing against the German government and the Nazis to be the first ones to develop this bomb. Because whoever could make the bomb first would be the one who would essentially win the war. The whole project to develop that bomb got the code name the Manhattan Project. This was a massive undertaking that cost the US government billions and billions and billions of dollars. It employed over 130,000 people from all across the country. And the interesting thing was most of those people had no idea what they were actually working on. They would be working on one specific part. Like they might be trying to figure out the best way to engineer a fin for the bomb, or they might be working on one tiny part of the science of it. There were very few people who actually knew that this was going to try to develop a nuclear weapon. It was that secret. The main site was in New Mexico in the middle of the desert called Los Alamos. It was in the desert so that they could test blowing up the bomb. There was also sites in Tennessee and at the University of Chicago as well, but the main site was Los Alamos. Some of the most brilliant physicists in the world worked on this project. The science side of the project was led by Robert Oppenheimer, and he became known as the father of the atomic bomb, and he was the director of the Manhattan Project. So we keep talking about an atomic bomb, but we're going to watch this video about 2 minutes to kind of explain what it actually means.
An atom bomb works on the principle that when you break up a nucleus of an atom, a large amount of energy is released. Why? Because it takes a large amount of energy to keep the nucleus bound together. When you split it apart, the energy is released. The analogy is like a stack of bowling pins. When you hit it with a bowling ball, all the energy that you used in stacking them is released. You can think of the nucleus of an atom being similarly stacked together. Physics purists may ding me for this analogy, but for the purposes of simplification, this is a good way to think of it. Scientists chose the biggest, heaviest nucleus that is found in nature to be the best candidate for splitting, uranium. Uranium is unique in that one of its isotopes is the only naturally occurring element on Earth that is capable of sustaining a nuclear fission reaction. A uranium atom has 92 protons and 146 neutrons. Together, they give an atomic mass of 238, or U-238. A very small portion of uranium, when it is mined, is in the form of an isotope, U-235. This isotope has the same 92 protons, but only 142 neutrons, or 3 fewer than U-238. U-235 is highly unstable, which makes it highly fissionable or splittable. When uranium U-235 is slammed by a neutron, it becomes uranium-236. U-236 is so unstable that it almost immediately splits into 2 more stable atoms, krypton and barium. In the process of splitting and creating 2 more stable atoms, a whole bunch of energy is released, along with 3 more neutrons. These 3 neutrons fly out.
Okay, so that is just a very, very kind of brief explanation of what's going on with an atomic bomb. If you want more information, there's tons of good information on the internet. So, at the end of the war, Germany had surrendered on May 8th, 1945. So the Soviet Union, who was an ally of America, was pushing in from the east of Europe, and they were conquering some of the Nazi-occupied territories there. And America was coming from the west, and they converged on Berlin. And Hitler actually ended up killing himself, and Germany and the Nazis surrendered, defeated by the Soviet Union and then the Americans with the help of the British and what was left of some of the other Allied forces. But if you remember, America was still fighting a war against Japan in the Pacific Ocean. And Japan was still very much alive in this fight. Franklin Roosevelt, the president during most of World War II, had died. He had succumbed to his polio, which is a terrible disease that had put him in a wheelchair for years. And his vice president, Harry Truman, took over. Interestingly, Harry Truman did not learn about the atomic bomb and its development until he became president, when he was told this. This was so secret that the vice president of the United States did not even know that it was going on. So the war against the Japanese was so different than the war against the Nazis for a couple of reasons. And it was so deadly to the Americans for a couple of reasons. Actually, more than a couple, but here are 2 of the main ones. The leader of the Japanese was named Emperor Hirohito. Emperor Hirohito was considered by a lot of the Japanese people as almost a godlike figure. He was divine in a lot of their opinions. And many Japanese felt that they would rather die than see the emperor dishonored by surrendering. This kind of played into the Japanese concept of the kamikaze. Kamikazes were usually in planes, and they were Japanese soldiers who would purposefully crash their planes into American troops and ships to kill themselves. In the Japanese culture at this time, surrender was more dishonorable than dying in battle. So a lot of Japanese soldiers fought until the death, even if there was no hope for them winning. And this made it very difficult for Americans to try to defeat the Japanese. And because even when the battle had been won, the Japanese continued to fight because they were more concerned with dishonoring themselves than preserving their lives. So the atomic bomb was dropped by a B-29 bomber known as the Enola Gay. A B-29 it's called a super fortress. It's a massive bombing plane. And the man who dropped it, the first bomb on Hiroshima, is right here. His name is Paul Tibbets. So Hiroshima was bombed on August 6, 1945. There were tens and tens of thousands of casualties immediately. I was looking up figures, and some of the numbers for the casualties for Hiroshima are kind of all over the place, but 70,000 people died pretty soon after it was dropped is the average. What happens when an atomic bomb detonates is there's an initial massive explosion that kills and destroys cities. But the most deadly part of an atomic bomb is what's left over afterwards, and that's radiation. So radiation, if you're exposed to radiation, it actually starts to degrade your cells, and your cells in your body start to break down. A lot of times superheroes in comic books get their powers through radiation, but that's not what happens in real life. In real life, your cells start to degrade and you actually die. Despite the massive destruction of Hiroshima, the Japanese did not immediately surrender. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a couple photographs, and I'm not going to tell you what they are right away. I want you to try to figure out that yourself. So here's the first one. So when I look at a historical photograph like this, I never try to figure out what it is first. What I do is I take in and I note all of the details and the stuff going on in the photograph. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a minute. Once I count down from 3, and I want you to pause it. And I just want you to write down what you see here. What are some of the, obviously it's a place. I want you to write down some of the key geographical features that you see. I want you to write down some of the other interesting stuff. And then we'll go on to the next photograph, and I'm going to ask you to compare the two. Okay, so pause it and spend about a minute writing that down in 3, 2, 1. Okay, welcome back. So this is the first photograph, and now we're going to move on to the second one. I want you to do the same thing. When I count down from 3, I want you to pause it, and I want you to write down some key features. This time, after you write down the key features, I want you to compare it to the first photograph. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. Okay, so looking at the two photographs, hopefully you have kind of determined that this is a before and an after photograph of Hiroshima, before the dropping of the atomic bomb and after the dropping of the atomic bomb. I want you to kind of note some things that tell you that. In this first photograph, notice how lively Hiroshima looks. There's boats on the river. There are hundreds and hundreds of buildings. There's busy roads. And notice there's 2 rivers. So one here and one here. Those 2 rivers are shown in this next photograph as well. So one here and one here, but they're from a different perspective. So this photograph was shot from probably about like right here. So that's why the perspective looks a little bit differently. Now, notice in the before picture, all the different buildings, all the different boats on the river. And notice here in the second one, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 buildings standing. Everything else is completely leveled. This just shows you the insane destructive power of an atomic bomb. Okay. A second bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. There were tens and tens of thousands of more casualties. This one was less deadly than Hiroshima because of the geography of Nagasaki, how it's kind of surrounded by mountains that prevented some of the explosion from spreading farther, but it still killed, I think I saw around 40,000 people. And the bomb, this is a reproduction of what the bomb looked like. There were actually two different types of atom bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first one is known as Little Man. This one that was dropped on Nagasaki was nicknamed, Little Boy was the first one. This one was nicknamed Fat Man. Sometimes I get those mixed up. And the trigger mechanism, how they cause the explosion, is completely different. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but that's really interesting to look up too if you're interested in that. So same kind of thing here is you can probably tell these are, again, the before and the after photographs for Nagasaki. But what I want you to do is I want you to compare the two. So when I count down from 3, I want you to pause it. And I want you to write down geographical features that tell you this photograph and this one are the same place. Then I want you to take a guess what ground zero means and what do you think these numbers in these circles means. So pause it in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this first photograph, I noticed the river. The river is the exact same. So the explosion might be massive, but it does not change the course of the river. And there's also some roads that seem to have survived, or were even drawn in on this one just to show you that it's the same place. Ground zero is where the bomb actually exploded. And these numbers symbolize distances. So these circles are like the first of like the wave of the explosion. So the most intense explosion was in here. The second, it was less intense out here, but it was still pretty powerful. I don't know if this is meters or yards, but your guess is as good as mine. Okay, so that's Nagasaki. So now that we talked about the bombs, I kind of wanted to show you what their impact was first before we talk about the reasons why they dropped them. So the main reason was to save American soldiers from an invasion of mainland Japan. As we saw when we talked about Emperor Hirohito and with the Japanese kamikaze culture, this was not going to be an easy invasion of Japan. The Americans would have to expend hundreds of thousands of Americans would die, and there'll be hundreds of thousands of Americans wounded in a massive invasion of mainland Japan because the Japanese tended to fight to the death in order to preserve their honor. President Truman had people advising him to drop the bomb, but he also had some people advising against it, saying that it was too powerful, that it was unnecessary, that the war was going to be won, and we didn't need this massive bomb. Casualty estimates for Americans were very high, as I mentioned. My grandfather actually fought in the World War II in the Pacific. He fought on the Battle of Okinawa. And he always said that the dropping the atomic bomb was the reason he was still alive, because if not, he would have had to been one of the people to invade mainland Japan, and he didn't think he would have survived that invasion. So we're gonna look at this map. I'm gonna talk about it for a second, and then I'm gonna ask you guys some questions about it. I want you to pause it when I count down again. So this is a map of the Western Pacific Ocean. America is far to the east, and you have Japan, China, Russia's up there. So hopefully some of these shapes should look familiar to you. What I want you to do is I want you to look at all the numbers here and over here and look at the dates. And I want you to pause it when I count down from 3. And I want you to tell me what you think these numbers and these dates show on this map. So 3, 2, 1. Okay, so hopefully you figured out that the numbers are actually battles that the Americans fought against the Japanese in the Pacific. I hope you noticed that the lower numbers match up to an earlier date, so 1942. And as we get to the bigger numbers, we get closer and closer to the time the atomic bomb was dropped and the end of the war. Notice how all the lower numbers are farther to the east. And as the Americans push west, the numbers get higher, and so do the dates. So these were the early battles, and as we get farther and farther west, we get to the later battles. This is called the American strategy of island hopping. So the Japanese were kind of tunneled into all of these little islands in the Pacific. And the Americans went from island, hop to another island, hop to another island, fighting and pushing the Japanese back. And eventually, before the atomic bomb was dropped, the Americans thought they would have to fight the final battles in mainland Japan. Another reason that the bomb was dropped was to serve as a statement to the Soviet Union. So you might be questioning, Mr. Prest, why are we trying to drop a bomb to kind of scare the Soviet Union? They're an ally, right? Well, here's a map of Eastern Europe. This is where Russia is. This is where Germany is. You can notice Italy's down here. You can see kind of the bottom of the boot. So hopefully that kind of orients you where you are. As the Soviet Union pushed back a German invasion, so the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union held them and started pushing them back. And they started reconquering all these territories that the Nazis had kind of like took it over. So they defeated the Nazis in all these places, pushing them back into Germany. But after the war, the Soviet Union did not just give these governments back over to the people. They installed their own communist governments and kind of took over all these places. So the Americans and Britain and France kind of started to realize that, hey, after this war is over, the Soviet Union might be our next big problem. And if you look back at this map, Japan and Russia, you can't really see it, are really close to each other. So Russia was actually getting ready to invade Japan. America did not want Russia to invade Japan because Russia would never leave. And that would be very detrimental to American interests. So let's look at this quote that kind of explains this well too. So this is a scientist, Leo, I think his last name is pronounced Slizard. He's meeting with the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is the government official kind of in charge of dealing with other countries. And that person who was dealing with other countries, later recall, was concerned about Russia's post-war behavior. Russian troops had moved into Hungary and Romania, and Burns thought it would be very difficult to persuade Russia to withdraw her troops from these countries, that Russia might be more manageable if impressed by American military might, and that a demonstration of the bomb might impress Russia. So there's a lot of evidence that America dropped the bomb to scare Russia, the Soviet Union, to say, hey, you need to stop invading all these countries and put the world kind of back to how it was and not mess with America because we have this massive bomb. So there's a couple, so as you hopefully have seen, the bomb is not as simple as it sometimes is portrayed. It caused massive damage to Japanese people and tons of suffering to innocent Japanese people who had nothing to do with the war. But it also saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. But it was also dropped to prove a political point to the Soviet Union. So it's complicated. And that just shows that history is not static. It doesn't just stay in one place. History can change based on how you tell it, based on the evidence and how you use your own bias or the author uses their bias to tell it. And because of that, you can tell the history of the atom bomb as triumph or tragedy based on from which perspective it's told. So that's what you're going to do on Thursday's mission. You're going to analyze two primary sources regarding the dropping of the atomic bomb in order to understand why there's a debate about whether or not it was justified, whether or not it was right to drop the bomb. You don't have to make up your mind. It's complicated. Oftentimes, there's not a clear answer to historical questions. But the important thing for this is that you can understand the debate. So check out that mission for Thursday, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks. Have a great day.